Did that take you by surprise when the UK has already said, look, we're okay, we're at ease with this Anthropic investment, but then the US takes a second look?
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right that I think a loser from these remedies would be Anthropic, the AI startup. The DOJ wants to unwind Google's investment in Anthropic. They want to go beyond that. I think it's a testament and a symbol of how sweeping these remedies are. And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting about this case is that, it was brought by the first Trump administration. I don't think they cared that much about the search default deals, but they wanted to kind of punish Google. And now I think what you see happening now that Biden's Justice Department has won the case, they don't seem that interested in the core of the case, which is really search default agreements, and instead are treating it as a kind of vehicle for pretty broad sweeping changes to Google's business, like unwinding things like their Anthropic investment.
The main one that Bloomberg had been reporting on and then was indeed substantiated by the DOJ was the selling off of Chrome. And many would, like you said, this doesn't seem to be going into the payments that were being made to Apple or to Samsung and other Android device makers to make Google search the default. But the fact that Chrome has about 60% market share when it comes to the browser market, and then a lot of people access search through it, would it not be a good idea to start peeling off some of the ways in which it dominates its search?
Well, the key point is that if the Justice Department thought that Chrome was a problem, it should have included Chrome in its original argument. That's the strange part about including it as a remedy. The DOJ never brought any charges against Google over Chrome. They never made any allegation that Google had, improperly preferenced its search engine in Chrome. But now they're invoking it in the remedies phase. So I think it's coming out of left field in the way the judge will reject. Look, Chrome is clearly very valuable for Google as a way to encourage people to spend time on the internet. It's good for Google's business. That's clearly true. But the idea that, it's valuable to other people, I just don't think it doesn't have any revenue of its own. It's not valuable if it's decoupled from Google's search results. Frankly, I just think it's very unlikely. I think it's about as likely that Google will be forced to sell Chrome as, Elon Musk's Doge commission is actually going to make the government more efficient.
Oh. That's taking us into a completely different avenue, Adam, so we'll get to that in another time. But I'm interested more broadly in some of the other areas. I mean, ones that took perhaps people aback was the idea that they'll be forced to license, sell off, or at least hand over their data, unique data, to other rivals, even as large a rival as Microsoft when it comes to the world of search. How technically feasible is that? And ultimately, how pro-competition is that sort of an outcome?
Yeah, well, I think technical feasibility, what the Justice Department has said is there should be a technical committee that really has full access to Google's source code, and that's obviously very invasive. You're absolutely right that things like spinning off Chrome got a lot of attention, but if you look in the details of this filing, you're absolutely right. They're proposing that Google have to make its secret sauce algorithms available to rivals, share its users' data with rival search engines, including, by the way, foreign search engines like Baidu and Yandex. There actually is a provision in there that would make Google pay for consumers to switch to competing search engines, which is like Pepsi paying, their customers to try Coke. It would make them fund paid advertising campaigns for rivals like Bing and DuckDuckGo. And I think of all these extreme remedies. I think they would not only deter Google from continuing to invest in search innovations if they have to share everything, but they're so extreme and they're so beyond the judge's findings. They're a bit like prescribing an limb amputation just because the patient has a hangnail.
The arguments you make are very clear, and we therefore try and play devil's advocate here. Me as the consumer, would any of this be good for me as a consumer if indeed Google is forced to open up? Were any parts of the ideas coming from the DOJ a remedy?
Well, I think the vast majority of people just want their search engines to work, right? And they want their search engines to answer questions for them. And, one of the things I think is interesting is that obviously the AI layer that Google is building into its search engine is a direct response to the success of things like ChatGPT. We saw a news report yesterday that OpenAI was going to probably build its own browser. But these remedies would take direct aim at that. They wouldn't allow Google, for example, to put in AI-generated results into its search results. And so I do think that would be a pretty direct violation of the consumer welfare standard, which has really been kind of the lodestar for antitrust enforcement. I concede that all of these remedies would be great for Microsoft and great for DuckDuckGo, but that's just not the way we historically do antitrust enforcement in the U.S.
Many had felt that actually there had been a slight changing in viewpoint of how you do antitrust in the US, particularly under Lina Khan and under now the current DOJ. What's notable, though, is this is going to change. We've got a new administration coming in 2025, and it's likelihood that Jonathan Kanter, who's been leading the charge on this particular case, hands over the reins. Do you think anything changes on the back of that? As you mentioned, it was the Trump administration that first brought this case.
That's right. And I think, frankly, the fact that Jonathan Kanter is on its way out is probably the main reason why these remedies are so sweeping. He's not going to be around for the trial about the remedies next year. A lot of the attorneys who've been prosecuting the case are, shopping their resumes around Washington. Trump's going to have a whole turnover in agencies like the DOJ. So Kanter doesn't have to own what happens next. And I think that's why he swung for the fences. I do think it's an open question about what the Trump administration will do. Trump named Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, as his next Attorney General. She will then decide who the head of the antitrust division will be. And there might be slight changes. I think that Trump likes having cases against big tech because, frankly, they provide him some kind of punishment or leverage over big tech services. But there might be changes in how they manage the case, might be different approaches to how they approach things like remedies.